This series that I've been doing on discovering about the schools of the prophets. I believe that the schools of the prophets are vital to what God wants to do in our day today, and so we really need to know more about them. And one of the things is that it's of real teaching regarding the schools of the prophets. And as we saw yesterday, there were 5 different schools of the prophets. What were the 5 schools of prophets? Well, we're going to start from there. Remember what they were? There was Gilgal, there was Bethel, there was Jericho, there was Mizpah, and there was Ramah. And those were the 5 schools of the prophets. And we saw Samuel, he traveled to Bethel, and he traveled to Gilgal, and he traveled to Mizpah, and he traveled to Ramah, but he didn't go to Jericho. And so that's one of the stops that he didn't have. Whereas Elijah, he went to Gilgal, and he went to Bethel, and he went to Jericho. So we see a difference in where Elijah went from where Samuel went. But both of them were senior prophets, and so it's very important for us to understand that. Well, I want to take a look at Samuel, the life of Samuel. Samuel, he was a senior prophet. What does a senior prophet look like? How does God call senior prophets, and what do they do? And so it's very important for us to understand, what a senior prophet is and how they differ from other prophets and what God anoints them to do. And so a senior prophet is a prophet that God has called to raise up and lead a school of prophets. And that's the difference that they have. And the reason why God does that is God is looking to have prophetic leadership where the leadership is in alignment with his heart. And so I'm going to say this. In prophecy, what is in our hearts is extremely important. One of the problems that I see in many prophets today is they never allow their heart to be checked. They don't allow God to remove the things that are in their hearts that are contrary to his character and contrary to his nature. I've had to go through a lot of seasons where God has removed things from my heart. And so during those time periods, I'm going to say this, when you're going through the process of God removing things from your heart, it is a very difficult process. It's not for the faint of heart, because God will often deal with us at our point of hurt, at our point of pain, and at the place where we've suffered in some particular area. And so senior prophets, they've been through that place of pain. In fact, they oftentimes are willing to grieve over what they've gone through. And so God leads them in that way. And so we're going to look at that today in the life of Samuel. Now, Samuel, and we're going into 1 Samuel chapter 3, and I want to just read what it says in 1 Samuel 3, starting in verse 1. And so just before I do that, in 1 Samuel chapter 2, one of the things that we see happening, and you can see this from 1 to about verse 12, I believe it is, and what you see is that Hannah actually prophesied. Hannah actually prophesied. So Hannah was herself a very prophetic woman. In fact, I'm going to just read what she prayed and prophesied in 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 1. It says, "And Hannah prayed and said," now this is her prophesying, "My heart rejoices in the Lord, mine horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth is enlarged over mine enemies, because I rejoice in thy salvation." And so Hannah, she herself was a very prophetic woman. And so I want you to really understand this. God works in the context of families. And so when God raises up prophets, he raises up prophets in the context of families and in the context of communities. Remember what I said? Each one of the prophets, except for Amos, identified who he was a son of. We see that in the New Testament, Anna, who was a prophetess, who did she identify herself as? The daughter of Phanuel. So what she was doing was following the example of the prophets in the Old Testament. We have Isaiah the son of Amos, Ezekiel the son of Buzi, we have Jeremiah the son of Hilkiah. And so in each one, they identified who they were a son of. And so it's very important that we really get this understanding. God works in the context of families. He works in the context of communities. And then what we see in Samuel is we see, and we've already looked at this, that there was a company of prophets. So he works in gatherings of prophets or in prophetic communities or prophetic schools. And so Samuel, he actually headed a prophetic school. And so we're going to delve into the prophet Samuel's life, but I want to just read a little bit more of the prophecy that was spoken by Hannah. Listen, there is none holy as the Lord, for there is none beside thee, neither is there any rock like our God. So she said she was chosen because she rejoiced in God's salvation. She rejoiced in the salvation that was offered in the Lord. She was one who rejoiced in God. And then she said she recognized the greatness of God. Now you have to remember, this was a time when idolatry was prevalent. There were many different types of prophets. There were the prophets of Baal. There were the prophets of Ashtaroth. So there weren't just prophets of the Lord. There were also other prophets. And they were false prophets that would lead people astray. So what we want to do is we want to identify what made Samuel different. And the first thing is he had a praying mother. He had a mother who was prophetic herself. And so I'm going to say this. How we relate to our sons and daughters, to our family, is extremely important in building a prophetic community. You know, sometimes I've seen that there's been division in prophetic communities where there's been accusation, elitism. You know, I was around in the 1980s and 90s when Kansas City, you know, there was a lot of elitism there, and it was confronted by some people and dealt with, and they humbled themselves. And so now we see another scandal emerging in Kansas City right now with Mike Bickle and some questions over his, sexual purity and his integrity. And so we need to recognize the prophetic operates as a family. We need to maintain that family understanding. It is very important. Hannah was a praying mother. She was a prophetic woman. And from Hannah, she gave birth to Samuel. Now, what's interesting to me, and I said this yesterday, the word that Eli spoke over Hannah was so powerful, the prophetic word, that she didn't just give birth to one child, she gave birth to several children. Do you see that? Sometimes we need to recognize the prophetic word has power. Eli, there was power in his prophetic words, even though the lamp of God had gone out, even though Eli had gone blind. But let's take a look in 1 Samuel chapter 3. Let's go over to 1 Samuel 3 and verse 1. And it says, "And the child Samuel ministered unto the Lord before Eli, and the word of the Lord was precious in those days. There was no open vision." Now that would change with Samuel. Now what was Samuel also called? And, you know, we see this in a different part, but Samuel, he was a seer. He was a seer prophet. And I'm going to say this, there is, among prophets, there are 5 different types of prophets, and one of them is a seer prophet, and specifically, they have open visions. Specifically, they have open visions. Samuel was a seer prophet, and he would have open visions. Now, I've known some men who operate in that kind of a seer ministry, where they have open visions, and from that point they begin to function out of the open visions. And oftentimes within the seer prophet's ministry, what you'll see is there are great miracles will begin to take place. And so, because the seer prophet will start to do what he sees God doing. And when we see what God is doing, miracles are released. And so the seer prophets, what do they bring? They bring miracles through the prophetic. And so, in fact, I'm going to say this, John the Baptist was the exception to the rule. He was not the rule regarding prophets. And in all of the prophets of the Old Testament, they moved in miracles. When you look at the life of Jonah, there were supernatural things that happened in Jonah's life. What do I mean? Well, there was a storm that came because of his disobedience. There was a fish that came and swallowed him because of his disobedience. The fish vomited him out when he decided to obey God. Jonah had an entire group of sailors who turned to God as a result of God punishing Jonah for his sin of disobedience. So here is the disobedient prophet Jonah, and the men are seeing the disobedient prophet, and what happens when they see what God is doing to the disobedient prophet? They present offerings to the Lord. They start to cry out to God. They're saying, Lord, have mercy and save us. And so I want you to understand that even the prophets in rebellion, they started to see miracles happen in their ministry. So Samuel, Eli was blind, his eyes were dim. Samuel, he was able to see. He was a seer prophet. And he brought vision back to the house of God. In verse 2, and it came to pass at that time, when Eli lay down in his place, and his eyes began to wax dim, that he could not see. And so Eli, he was no longer able to see. Well, who was another patriarch who wasn't able to see very well? Do you remember his name? Well, you got it. His name was Isaac. And what happened as a result of Isaac not being able to see? Well, he was deceived. Who was he deceived by? He was deceived by his own son, Jacob. And what does Jacob mean? Jacob means deceiver. And so here we have Jacob deceiving his father and taking advantage of the fact that Isaac was unable to see very well. Here we have another father, Eli, and he's not able to see very well. In the Bible, sight is extremely important. We need to have vision. We need to have seer prophets in our day. And I'm believing God. We had some, seer prophets, but they've been very rare, very few and far between. And we don't want that to be the case, do we? We want to have seer prophets that see what the Lord is saying. In fact, one of the seer prophets that I know of, he actually was praying, and God gave him a phone number of someone to call. And so what he did is he called that phone number, and when he called that phone number, guess who picked up? Well, it was the President of the United States. It was a private phone number that he shouldn't have been able to know, and yet he received it by revelation. And guess what? The next thing, there were a whole bunch of Secret Service agents showing up at his place. And so, Yes, seer prophets are important. Yes, we need seer prophets in our day. No, we really don't have them. They are very rare in our day. I was friends with a very good seer prophet, John Paul Jackson, and he would have visions of headlines of what would happen in the future. God would put them on newspaper, like a newspaper heading, and he would see those things and headings regarding the future. And then he would share what they were. But he was a seer prophet. I remember being in his meetings, he would see the angel of the Lord going from person to person and ministering to that person. Wouldn't you like to have that happen, where you have a prophet and they're a seer and they're seeing what is happening in the invisible realm? And that as a result, God begins to confirm his word with signs following? You see, I believe in the seer prophet, and the seer prophet's ministry was brought back through the prophet Samuel. And ere the lamp of God went out in the temple of the Lord. And so when there's no vision, the lamp of God will go out. In other words, there will be no light in the house of God. Why? Because nobody is taking care of the light of God. There was a light in the tent, and and the Moses' tent was, and so that light, was supposed to give light there, and so there was no light in the temple of the Lord, or in the tent of God where the ark was. And the Lord called Samuel, and he said, "Here am I." And so I'm going to say this. When God calls a man or a woman to be a prophet, what you will see is a humble submission to the voice of God. They don't question what God is saying. They don't debate with God. What do? They submit to the call of God. When all of the apostles were called into ministry, the moment they heard Jesus' voice, the Bible says they left everything to follow him. And so here we have Samuel, and he's being called upon by God, but he didn't know the Lord's voice. And we saw that there was a moment yesterday where Samuel began to know the voice of the Lord. And I'm going to say this, when we begin to wait upon the Lord, and I've already taught about that regarding Deuteronomy 32. Remember what I said? Where did Jesus learn how to hear the voice of God from? Moses. Who taught Jesus how to hear the voice of God? Moses. Who are we supposed to be listening to? Jesus. What does it say in Hebrews chapter 1? That God in these last days has spoken unto us by his Son. And so Moses and Jesus are in harmony. There's not a difference between Moses and Jesus. And both of them were speaking for God. In fact, what did Moses say? He said, "A prophet like unto me shall the Lord your God raise up among you from among your brethren. Him shall you hear, and the people who don't hear him will be cut off from their people." And so we need to make sure that we allow God to teach us how to hear his voice. I've already taught on that out of Deuteronomy 32. And so if you haven't heard that teaching, you need to go back and listen to that. What is Deuteronomy 32? What is that called? It's called the Song of Moses. What are they singing in heaven and in the book of Revelation? They're singing the song of who? Moses, and the song of the Lamb. Moses and Jesus. And so these are very important to the ministry of the prophet. And so one of the things that I'm concerned about is the prophetic today doesn't have those two pillars of the prophetic in their midst. We're going from other patterns rather than going from the pattern prophet Moses, and which Jesus was patterned after Moses, and Jesus himself is a pattern prophet for the New Testament prophet. And so if we don't go back and understand who Moses is, we can't understand how Jesus is in alignment with Moses, and then we can't get ourselves in alignment with Jesus as the prophet. Do you see the order of God? How does God teach us? Line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little and there a little. And so we have to go from, we have to allow God to build the house properly. You see, when the house is not built properly, when it's not founded on the right foundation, you get all of this willy-nilly stuff. And there's a lot of willy-nilly stuff out there regarding prophetic ministry. And I'm not going to talk about it today. I'm going to save that for a different day where I'll deal with a lot of the willy-nilly stuff that's out there regarding prophets and prophecy. But we really need to know Moses, and we need to know Jesus, because Moses is the pattern prophet that Jesus was patterned after, and the New Testament prophet is patterned after Jesus, and all believers are supposed to be listening to who? Jesus. In these last days, God has spoken unto us by his Son. So he's speaking to us through his Son today. And so that's why the entire church is meant to be prophetic. Remember what I said before? 1 Corinthians 14, if we come into the church and all prophesy, the unbeliever is convinced of all, he is judged of all, and the secrets of his heart are made manifest. And God, he will say, God is in you of a truth. By the way, we don't have that today, do we? So what does that mean? That means we have a lot of growing to do in our understanding of the prophetic ministry. We need to grow in our understanding of the prophetic ministry. We are at a very surface level understanding of prophecy. Did you know that prophesying isn't the primary function of a prophet? Oh boy. What is the primary function of a prophet? A prophet is called to build the church. That's the New Testament prophet. So if you find a prophet that is tearing down the church, guess what? They are out of order. They're not functioning after the order that Christ established, and that means they're operating either inaccurately or they're operating as a false prophet. And so we need to be careful. Why is that? Because Jesus said there's going to be a lot of false prophets and a lot of false Christs. And so we don't want to be among that number, do we? We want to be true prophets. We want to declare who the true Christ is, and his name is Jesus. So let's go ahead and continue. And the Lord called Samuel in 1 Samuel 3, verse 4, and he answered, Here am I. And he ran unto Eli. And I'm going to say this. Eli, he was a prophet as well, even though the scripture doesn't talk about him being a prophet. And he prophesied to Hannah, and she gave birth to Samuel. And so Eli, he was off. Eli was a father in the prophetic. He oversaw the school in Shiloh, which was the prophet's school in Shiloh. But because he allowed his sons to continue in sin, what did God do? He judged Eli, he judged Eli's house, and he shut down the school of prophets. And I'm going to say this, God is not, he will shut things down if there's sin in our camp. We don't want sin in our camp, do we? He will shut down things. And that means fathers in the prophetic need to learn how to deal with sons. And I'm going to say this, we don't really have that, do we, today? There's not a lot of accountability, among apostles and prophets, or even evangelists, pastors, and teachers. We lack that vital ingredient of accountability. And so it's very important for us to have accountability over ourselves as prophets or those who are called to the prophetic ministry. We need to pay attention. Why is that? I'm going to say this. Ultimately, it's not about what people see that I'm doing. It's what God sees that I'm doing. And I'm going to stand before God for what I'm teaching, and you're going to stand before God for what you're doing. Now that is a very sobering thing, isn't it? Especially for those called into ministry, especially when people are giving to support the work of God. I'm accountable for each dollar and dime that I receive. And so it's very important for us to understand that. So Samuel, he heard Eli, and very often at the very beginning of the prophet's relationship, or the beginnings of the prophet's calling, when they're around a senior prophet, they'll hear God in the voice of the senior prophet. And so Samuel, he thought it was Eli. It's a very common occurrence. Now, that will change as the prophet matures and as the prophet grows. And so, that will change over time as we follow on to know the Lord. And let's read in verse 6. And the Lord called yet again Samuel, and Samuel arose and went to Eli, and he said, Here am I, for you to call me. And he answered, I called not, my son, lie down again. So this shows just how in the spiritual state of where Eli was. He was not only blind, but he was deaf to the calling of God. He didn't recognize what was of the Lord and what wasn't of the Lord. And I'm going to say this, if you don't have a senior minister, a senior prophet who knows what is of the Lord from what is not of the Lord, that is a problem. If there's no correction among the prophetic ministry, we get into error, and God doesn't want us to be in error. Going into verse 7, now Samuel did not yet know the word of the Lord, neither was the word of the Lord yet revealed unto him. There comes a point in every prophet's life where the word of the Lord is revealed to them. Where does that happen? Well, remember when I was teaching about the Song of Moses and waiting on the Lord? It is in our time of waiting on the Lord and allowing God to minister to us, just abiding in his presence and learning how to see an increase of his presence in our lives. As we're waiting upon the Lord, what will happen? That prophetic presence will grow. And as that prophetic presence grows, what we will see is an increase of the spirit of prophecy. And that increase of the spirit of prophecy, what it will do, it will cause the prophet or the person to have the word of the Lord revealed to them. And so we need the word of the Lord revealed to us. We need to know what is of the Lord from what is not of the Lord. And not everything that we hear is from God. Just because you think that you've heard from God doesn't mean that you've heard from God. One of the things that I've had to learn how to do, and it took me a long time to do this, but I had to learn how to discern the voice of God from other voices around me, from the voice of people, from the voice of the devil. There was a time in my life when I didn't know the difference. I still remember I was in a campground at a navigator's campground, and we were just there to learn about God and to do things at the campground. And so I'm lying down in my bunk bed. I was on the top bunk of my bunk bed, and I heard this voice, and the voice said, throw yourself down, and his angels will catch you. Does that sound familiar? Now, by the way, I didn't know my Bible like I do now. I didn't know anything about who that was coming from. But guess what? And I thought, oh, maybe that's God. Maybe God is wanting me to do this. Maybe God is wanting me to throw myself down. And so from that moment, what did I do? I began to learn how to discern the voice of God from the myriad of other voices. including the voice of the enemy. Now, by the way, the devil comes with a smooth sound. He doesn't come with a pitchfork and with a red suit and with horns, and he doesn't come with blazing fire. He comes as a bright angel to try and lead us astray. So the devil always comes looking good, and he comes looking like he's good. Well, I've come to the end of my time. I'm going to have to continue this tomorrow. And I just want to remind you of my books on this series on prophecy, how to know if your prophecy is really from God and what to do if it is, plugging into the spirit of prophecy, adding power to your prophetic words, entering the school of the prophets, training a prophetic generation. You can get those at www.lighthouse-publications.com, or you can get them at bethlehembookstore.com, or you can go to amazon.com and you can get them there. And so I just want to encourage you. I'm teaching out of this book on entering the school of the prophets. And so I have a depth of understanding regarding the schools of the prophets. And I talk about the 5 different schools of prophets in here. And there are 5 different schools. There are 5 different types of prophets. Very important for us to know. There's not just one type of prophet. There are 5 different types of prophets. And today we only know about one type of prophet or 2 types of prophets. There's 5 types of prophets. You need to buy this book. They're only $25 on the website. Also, I would encourage you to support the broadcast at Cash App, $Prophet Wallis, or you can go to Venmo at Prophet Wallis, or Zelle, the Miracle Center, and that's CENTRE at earthlink.net, or PayPal, paypal.me/Miracle Center, CENTRE. We already had somebody give us this wonderful microphone. Really is a blessing to the broadcast, and we're very thankful for it. And so I just want to, this is what we're trying to do. We want to enhance the broadcast, not for our benefit, but for the benefit of those who are watching. We want to bring a better program, a better quality of program, and we want to be able to upgrade what we're doing to make it just much better for everybody who's watching, because we want you to learn and to grow in what you're doing. Also, we want to build a school of prophets here in Crystal River, Florida. And so God is calling me to do that. I had a good friend of mine, Dr. Kenny Russell, in January of this year. He came from Israel, and he, it's really a shocker how he got here, but somebody brought him over here, and he called me. He said, I want to come down. I said, oh, okay. And so he came down, and so now he had everything provided for him. God, worked supernaturally in his life, and we saw just, and so he came down here, and it was a tremendous blessing to have him. But he said, now is the time for the school, and I've been waiting since 2002 to do that. So, I'm privileged to be able to start the school, and I'm grateful for you who are watching what we're doing. And I want to encourage you, invest in the school of prophets. Bless a prophet in the name of a prophet, and you will receive a prophet's reward. What is that? Well, the person who donated the microphone, what did they get? Their business just opened up immensely. A lot of business started coming their way, and it was an amazing opening for them. And even now, it's continuing. So I would encourage you, bless the prophet's house, and God will bless you with your own house. Maybe you need a house right now. Bless the prophet's house. Help us to build the school. Watch what God does for you. I believe it will be an amazing thing. Well, anyways, we've come to the end of our broadcast. I love each one of you. Every day, Tuesday through Friday, at 11 a.m., the prophet's house. And we just want to remind you to be here. We'll see you tomorrow. We love each one of you. Bless you in the name of Jesus. Amen.